Hey everyone, I'm excited to introduce you to Robin Ritch, who recently wrote a book called Using Friction to Grow. Now, Robin is a fantastic thought leader, had been a leader in the tech segment in Silicon Valley, and just has really an awesome career, which later led her to be the president of Deseret News, right? And she recently worked on this book focusing on the case studies of women, Latter-day Saint women in the 1970s. Many of these women are in their 70s and 80s now, and she were looking for those individuals who were change makers, who were Zion builders in that time, and how they did that while also experiencing friction, whether that was friction from society, from their families, from their local wards, from the church, and how that sanctified them and developed them into phenomenal disciples. This is the type of content that here at Leading Saints we live for, because we are a community of Zion builders, not just leaders or people with callings, though we focus on that too, but Zion builders. And this is a remarkable resource, and Robin is a remarkable person to speak to this concept of how do we use a life of friction that feels like we should stop and that we should slow down and maybe reconsider where we're going, but actually find true sanctification in that journey. So you'll definitely appreciate this conversation as we explore how women in our recent history have done that. So here's my interview with Robin Ritch. Robin, when was the moment that you knew you needed to write the book of Using Friction to Grow?
So really great question. So I was out to lunch with Christine Durham. She was the first woman Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Utah. And she was also the first woman to be on the Supreme Court. And we were at lunch. I'm friends with her, and we were at lunch, and she was talking about how during the 1970s, how there was a real pushback around women in the church, and a lot of the things that she was doing, she got a lot of pushback around. And it was quite disturbing, some of the things that she was telling me. And of course, I didn't know anything about that because I grew up in Seattle, so I wasn't here in the Utah culture. And also I was too young, and also it was too recent history, so no one ever talked about it to me. So as she was talking, I was getting more and more like, I don't understand. And she said, I asked her, hey, so I don't understand. Why did you stay? Why did you stay active in a faith community that was actively against what you believed in what you were doing?
So, and during this time, she was doing going to law school and doing the things.
She had graduated. She went to Duke Law School, and she was a advocate for women's rights. So just a history thing that I didn't know. So back in the she was, marched on our college campus for civil rights in the late 60s, and was a big proponent of civil rights. Like a lot of people during that time, right out of the civil rights movement at the end of the 1960s, became the feminine movement. So women really trying to have, so until the mid 70s, they couldn't have a checking account. They couldn't have a credit card. You couldn't go to college and just pick any major. There were certain majors in particular colleges that you could go to. You couldn't get financial aid. You could be fired for being a woman, getting married, having kids. There was all these things going on in the early 70s. So there was this huge movement to try and rectify some of those things. Christine Durham was a proponent of moving women forward with those rights. And so she was very outspoken on that. She wrote pamphlets on that, and she was an attorney. So, and she throughout her career has always worked with marginalized groups. And that was the same time when the Equal Rights Amendment was happening. So for a really convoluted history, which none of us know because we were too young. But at the end of the day, there was an Equal Rights Amendment. They needed to have 38 of the states ratify it, and 35 had ratified. So it was almost being ratified. And it was up for ratification in the state of Utah. So Christine was somebody that was a feminist, so she was moving that forward. And at the time, I guess feminism was a bad word. Really, it just at the time meant you thought men and women should have equal rights. So she was moving that forward. There was a huge effort within the church. At one point, it started to be against that, to be against those movements for women.
Yeah, wasn't it like an official stance? The church came out against ERA?
They did. They came out about a month before it was voted on in Utah. about a month before, but they were silent mostly up until that point.
So a lot of tension there.
There was a lot of tension.
Being
a member was a lot of tension, especially if you were in one of the states where it was up for ratification. So like I grew up in Seattle, it wasn't up for ratification. They ratified it right away in the state of Washington. Plus I was like in diapers. So again, not something I was aware of.
You weren't voting.
No, it was not aware of. And so there was a lot of tension if you were somebody that thought that was a vehicle to get women's rights. We've actually since then gotten a lot of those rights corrected, right? Through different codes. And actually, I didn't put it in the book, but Christine told me that one of the things she did after that was not ratified and during that time is they went through the state code here in the state of Utah and tried to rectify every single one of those issues so they did it without having an amendment. They did it by pushing it through here in the state and rectifying some of those state statutes and codes, which is another way to do that so that women, wouldn't be fired if they were pregnant or things like that. Anyway, so long story. So then she was telling me a lot about the friction that happened where, women were judging women, men were judging women for working, like all this stuff was going on. And that's why I asked, like, why'd you stay in? Like, that seems like be really tough.
She had every reason to step
I was
away
like,
from
that
our
seems
faith
really
and culture.
tough.
Yeah.
And she said something that was so interesting. And I can't even explain it other than I felt like a light bulb hit me of like, these stories need to be told. So what she said is, we knew about our grandmothers. And so we knew that they were doing all these things and were suffragettes and they were moving forward and doing all these things. And so we just thought, well, we know about our grandmothers, so we're going to do this. And what struck me is we don't have the stories from that grandmother's generation. So the women that are like 80 right now, we don't have their stories. They're not anywhere. They're not in our church canon. They're not telling them really. And the strength that they had, knowing their grandmother's stories. And the thing I think sometimes we forget is like, nothing's new. We think it's new that people have a hard time staying in the church because there's friction. That's not new. Like that's not a new thing. And so to know about the grandmother generation and what they faced, I think is super important. So I went on this journey of interviewing a lot of women that during that time, between 1968 and 1974, 76-ish, were making their career decisions and they chose to have careers and they chose to stay faithful in the church. And I just wanted to understand like their stories, like what drove them to stay? Why would you stay in a faith community that maybe was kind of against what the life path you chose?
Yeah. And this, centers on that friction concept of there's obvious friction there, but it was actually, there's a purpose to it in growing and so forth. I mean, from the beginning, how do you respond to people saying, no, like they just need to get with the program, follow what the church says, follow what the brethren say, and that will bless their lives the best they can? Because in hindsight, I think a lot of older generation worries that like, no, if we highlight those who went against general counsel, what will they do today, right? How do you process that? Yeah,
I've actually run into that a little bit since the book came out last week. I think that the bigger thing is I'll just say this about the women I interviewed. Universally, they were alive during the civil rights movement and a lot of them participated in the civil rights movement. And then they would go to church and they'd be like, woof, we don't really have blacks in the priesthood in our church. This doesn't match up. Without exception, all of them prayed about that, labored with that, tried to understand that, talked to leaders, really tried to figure out what that looked like. And kind of got their own revelation of like, yeah, you might be right, but stay in. And so I feel like they had a muscle that they got by going through that struggle. And then when the women working came up for them right in the face, they already kind of knew what that looked like, what that friction looked like. On the friction thing. So I do believe the church is an absolute vehicle that helps us understand God and helps us become closer to God through many, many ways. But it's, again, a vehicle. We have to have a relationship with God and with our Savior. And I think the role, I think these women all looked at the role of a prophet was the prophet is called to call us to repentance, which just means change. And so I think they looked at the prophet as somebody that did that for them in their lives. So when they'd hear what he said, they would then go and use that same muscle and pray about it, work with their husbands praying about it, fast, do whatever that process was for them to get comfortable with their answer. I think the other thing that's unique is they were so empathetic and gracious about everyone else's answer, meaning they knew that that was the answer for them specifically, and to feel comfortable with their relationship and God, that was their answer. They didn't necessarily feel like I need to go out and judge everybody else for their answer, but they really gave grace for everybody else. Like everyone's going to have a different answer. We're very unique. And I do think the role of friction in the gospel, I mean, we believe in opposition in all things. Literally, if we have no friction, we pick Satan's plan. I mean, like that's the plan. There's no friction. But I think friction, just from a, physical law, friction slows you down. That's what it's meant to do. I mean, that's why I have brakes in my car so that I don't hit somebody. Yeah. I use my friction brakes. And so it does slow you down. And it can slow you to a stop potentially. And I think that's some of the challenges people have. It slows you all the way to a stop. But sometimes you can push through it. And when you push through friction, if you're a rock, it rubs off the rough edges. Like it makes it smoother so you can go faster later. So I do think that it's by divine design that when friction shows up, it is for you to grow. It's for you to grow. It's for you to have time to go figure out who is God? Like, who is he in my life? Are my ideas of him correct? Or through this experience, am I learning even more about him? And I think without friction, you don't get to learn that. Like you're not getting that.
Yeah. So I like how you're framing this in a faith promoting context of we may hear things during general conference or from the general church or even from the local church and local church leaders where we think, that doesn't sit right. Now, that doesn't mean you're wrong, they're wrong, you're unworthy, they're worthy. Yeah. It's more of like, great, now what are you going to do with it? And it's in that wrestle where a lot of sanctification can come. Absolutely. Regardless of who's right.
I don't know that there's a lot that we know that is right. I mean, that's why it's a religion and faith. Like there's so much we don't know. And I think we keep getting continuing revelation. Someone said something that was interesting to me and I thought, that's right, which is sometimes you can get personal revelation maybe ahead of organizational revelation. It might be faster to just get your own personal revelation than for organization revelation to come. And I think we keep seeing that. And that's why things keep getting revised. Like they just announced, hey, we're going to have Sunday school and
split schedule. Right?
Yeah. So like maybe someone got an answer a long time ago. Some, young women's president or young men's president was like, I'd really like to see the young men or the young women every week. I don't know that this is the best for them. Maybe they got the answer of like, yeah, you're right. It would be better if you saw them. But organizationally, it's going to take longer to get that that answer and then implement it. There's an implementation thing that takes a while.
I think this is a great example. I was just thinking about this morning. We're recording this a day after this announcement of the going from the alternating to the split schedule. And one could say, well, what, President Nelson got it wrong? Like, did he miss the revelation? Wasn't this God's will? Or no, it's like we're a organization run by mortals, and God isn't going to necessarily be like, and this is the perfect way that church needs to be. It's like, I don't know, try some things, figure it out. Yeah. Did that work? We've done it a few years. Let's try this other thing, right? And I even hesitate when sick people are framing it as revelation, which revelation can mean several things, but I don't think there's a scroll in the Quorum of the 12 that came from the ceiling saying, this is the celestial church schedule, right? Yeah. But again, we're trying different things, and maybe there's people thinking, I had this idea from the beginning, we should have done it this way, but that's just not how the church works as an institution.
I talked a little bit about this in my book because I did a whole context chapter on what if you lived in what if you were a 22-year-old woman in 1970, what would that look like for you? Because I didn't know what it was going to look like. And in that chapter, I kind of talked a little bit about revelation and implementation. And I think because implementation is how it gets rolled out, right? And when I think about the way I get revelation, I know everyone gets it differently, but I've never gotten an entire paragraph. I've never gotten an entire sentence, actually. I usually get like a little chunk. And then where I get in trouble, if I get in trouble, is when I start going with my mind of like, well, that must mean this, and then I'm going to implement it this way and this way, right? And then, so I think sometimes the implementation is what we do as humans, but God might have said, hey, it's really important to think about this one thing. Like it might have been really important that maybe the ERA, the actual legislation was a little bit flawed, and the better way was to have all the statutes redone, right? So maybe that was the revelation of like, I don't know, this might have unintended consequences. But then a human imitation is like, no, actually it means that the question is work, not work. And that's something we kind of do as humans of like, no, this little nugget I got from him means this thing over here, and we implement against that. And then we just keep having to change those things. So when I think about, yes, I absolutely do believe they get revelation. And as my role at Deseret News, I saw that working, I do think they get absolute revelation. I think sometimes when we implement it, that's where, it's like, okay, on our best knowledge, bounded by, I have lived more than in the United States, but I've only lived in the United States, bounded by that and my experience as highly educated, middle class growing up, that's my implementation is going to look different than somebody that grows up in mainland China, has a different experience. And so that's what we're playing with, I think. Yeah.
And there's often this concept, this dynamic that comes up. I call it the ex-girlfriend syndrome, where like when we went from 3 hours to 2 hours, we like roll our eyes at the silliness of 3-hour church, or before Come Follow Me, he's like, can you believe we actually did this differently? That was so like as if there was an error or a wrong way in doing it, when it's no, we're just iterating, we're just implementing and seeing what works and improving as we go. Not because the thing before was flawed.
Right.
The reality is the thing right now is probably flawed, but we're just learning. Right.
We're trying to just grow. We just need to grow. I mean, I think that we came here to grow. So
there's this concept I see is like, taking it to modern day times of maybe more heavy issue like the ERA was back then. Well, now I feel like you mentioned, through different legislations, we've made several of those steps.
Yes.
Are we there yet? No, but it is what it is. So, but there are people who are like, who feel this, they have a hope in change rather than a hope in Christ. So they stay engaged in the church because, well, come on, we know that the church is going to allow same-sex sealings. So just stick around, we'll be fine. But then it like stimulates this disappointment and even can set faith up for more destruction because it didn't happen. Well, why isn't it happening? Why? And then because they're having faith in this outcome rather than faith in Christ and his redeeming power, right? So do we have to be careful with having like this feeling, like feeling that friction, knowing that, oh, this will go away, so I'm just going to jump into the friction? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think there's a couple ways to answer that. I think one of the things that I learned from all these women, so in the book, I kind of I interviewed all these women and then I just tell their story. And what's was interesting is all of them are so unique. Which is true of our wards and our everywhere. Like everybody's unique. Everyone gets in a unique path to take on this life. And I think the one true thing that, there's a lot of true things, but one true thing here is, if you have a question, you can go study it out, take it to the Lord, and you might not get an answer. Like I have had ones where I will never forget, I prayed about something for, I don't know, like 6 months. I was like really concerned about it a long time ago. A decade later, I will never forget, I was sitting somewhere and someone said the answer. And I felt like God was like, hello, that's the answer you prayed for like 10 years ago. And I'm like, that was 10 years ago. I've moved on.
What have you been doing?
Yeah, so I've moved on. Yeah. So I just think that the answer really is friction is sent. The thing that I talk a little bit in the book about this is, I don't think we're ever going to have a bow on this present that is the church. Mm-hmm. We're just not.
We did it. We're done.
No, there's no bow. Yeah. Because I think by design, it's set up to have boundaries in it, to have ideology. All organizations do. And you're going to bump up against those. And that is the beauty of the church, because it gives you friction points. And friction points can allow you to have growth. And so I think you can use that principle to always say, this is giving me friction. How do I want to deal with this? Does this help me understand who God is more and my Savior is more? And so I don't pretend to know all the thorny issues are out there for sure. But I do think these women had huge thorny issues that were social, and we have thorny issues today that are social. And I think in 50 years, it'll be the same. Like that's not going away. So I think that's not going away. So then the question is, what is the benefit of having a religion in your life? And I think that's what we should really be talking about, which is it's a vehicle. Like I have ordinances I can do that remind me and touch kind of eternity. I have ability to serve in ways that I get to be around people I would never know if I wasn't there. I get to participate, in a way with Christ in the way he set up to have these rituals. So there's real benefits that if you focus on just this thing that's the thorny issue instead of looking at the whole beautiful picture, I think that's when you it gets worse for you. And I did say friction can slow you all the way down. It's what you choose to do with it in that slowdown point.
Yeah. My mind goes to the, story of Jacob wrestling God.
Yeah.
And God breaks his hip. And Jacob says, I will not let go until you give me a new name. Like he could have just succumbed to the wrestle all right, you pinned me.
Yeah,
I surrender. But it's more like, I will stay engaged with God until you give me something more. Right. And I think as we get older with hindsight in our life, we can see time after time where it's like, oh, I just stayed engaged. It wasn't that there's anything particular about that scenario that revealed anything, but now looking back on it, like I'm a better person. I'm a different person. I have a new identity. Right. It's really powerful. So tease us with another story or woman in your book. I just want to sprinkle these throughout our interview.
So there's this one woman that she had, so the other, one thing I will say is for the most part, all the women had never told their stories to their family, which is super interesting. And I don't think we do that. I don't think we sit down and get these nuggets and like, what? You had the ERA was a thing for you? Like we don't get these nuggets. So that being said, I sat down with this one woman and she was telling me the story. She's like, oh, I've never told anybody in my family the story, just my husband. And she told me the story about a really awful experience with the bishop that this
has never happened before.
No,
so we're listening.
The thing is, okay, let's be clear. People, they all had great experiences with priesthood leaders and terrible experiences with priesthood leaders. So
as we all have,
that's
right?
the thing. Like, I don't know why we think it's going to be different. But anyway, this particular one called her in and told her that he decided he was going to excommunicate her.
Oh, wow. So this went sour.
Really sour, really fast, because he was convinced that she was an apostate and, beating her children, all this crazy stuff that this woman was like, what are you talking about? This isn't even true of me. Like, because she had a job. So,
I see.
So she had a job, and
so he interpreted that as some type of neglect or abuse. Right?
I don't know. Okay. So she said he was, and the way she explained it was he was very angry and like really yelling at her and all this stuff. And she said she felt the Spirit just push her forward in her chair, and she's like, I'm a really timid Mormon girl, and she's like, I felt the Spirit push me forward in the chair, and she said, I just, it came out of my mouth. I don't understand church policy or church courts or whatever, but I know that if you want to excommunicate somebody, you have to have some evidence, and there's no evidence of this. And so she said she got up and walked out, which is counter to her personality.
Especially 40, 50 years ago, or whenever it was.
So,
right?
And so why I'm telling this story is not because of that, because that's obviously horrendous. But what was super interesting to me is she said she drove around this is on a Sunday afternoon. She didn't want to go home. She drove around for a couple hours, and she heard a voice finally. She was like ranting and screaming in the car, and how could he, and what is this? And I have my calling. I'm in. I read my scriptures. I'm doing all this stuff. And she heard a voice that said, whose church is this? Whose is it? And she immediately felt this like overwhelming love and just the Savior, and knowing it was his, it wasn't that bishop's, and that he knew of her, the Savior knew of her, and that she had followed the path that he had laid out for her, and that she was okay. And she went back and told her husband, and then has never told anybody since. But I think there's lots of women and men and youth and whatever that have, equally disturbing experiences, but then for her, it brought her straight to Christ. It's brought her straight back to him and her relationship with him. And those kind of stories like give me real hope, because that's horrible that happened to her.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, would you say like friction should be expected as God's inviting you into something greater?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what his tool is. His tool is friction for sure. Because we all know when it's really easy, like really easy.
You're kind of like, something's around this corner here.
Yeah, something's really around that corner.
Yeah.
And I think it's just reframing. We just need to reframe and realize if you're feeling friction, it doesn't mean, hey, this isn't for me. It's more, let's engage then. Like you said that earlier, like, let's engage. This is the time to engage and figure out how I can grow from this, how I can rough off my rough edges. And I think that's what all these women did. That's what was so interesting.
Yeah.
There's another story. I will tell this other story. Please. This one woman, she got divorced. It was kind of a public divorce in her ward. And she was like, I don't want to haul these 3 little kids to church tomorrow. I'm not interested. This is going to be terrible. And she thought to herself, well, actually, what I should do is just like go away for a while and then come back, and they'll be so excited that I've reactivated myself that no one will ever ask me these hard, tough questions. And she said she had an experience where she just felt or thought or heard, well, how will they know what you believe? How will they know? Meaning her children. And she just, at that moment, thought, I do believe in Christ. I do believe going and participating in a, flawed group of people together, trying to get more light and see Christ is important. And I'm going to go. And I just thought so many of them had experiences like that where, God kind of intervened in their worst moment and just let them know that they were seen for who they were and what they were going through.
Yeah. Was there a reason you focused on stories of women specifically? Like maybe you related to that most, because I'm sure men experience the same dynamic to some degree.
I would agree that this friction thing is universal. I focused on the women because honestly, when Christine was saying that to me, we knew about our grandmothers. I knew, we don't have any of these women's stories. We don't. You're not in Relief Society, so you don't know this, but like if we talk about women, we go back to Emma or Eliza Snow or Susan Gates, or like 150 or 200 years ago is who we're holding up. And so there needs to be some relevant, relatable stories. I mean, those women were amazing. I'm not saying they weren't, but they also were in an environment, was the wild, wild west here. It was a brand new church. Like it's not relatable at all. Whereas I have to say, when I interview those women, when they were talking about their 20s, they were talking about how the 20-year-olds today talk about the life. So they were embarking on this, like they thought it was super idealism. The world was opening up to them. It was education was available. Like it was really changing all of a sudden for them. And they just had high hopes. And I look at the generation that's coming up now and they have a similar thing happening. And I just thought we need to bring these two generations together. Like they need to know that their grandmothers, I mean, we all think it's always new, but it's not. Like their grandmothers faced things that were really hard and were able to reason through it and think through it and pray through it and get comfort through it. And that needs to translate to us today and women today. And so really, I mean, the honest answer is, we don't have the women's stories. So I wanted to have them. Yeah.
Is there anything else you would say to the woman out there because what I appreciate about some of these stories is that it's not like this person was running for Senate, or it's like these big stories, right? This big, consequence or things. It's more like, I had this really tough interaction with my local leader, or I was struggling just with this invitation I was feeling as a mother when it just didn't make sense, but I knew God was in it, right? So anything else you'd say to that woman out there who's like just sort of depleted, frustrated? I've tried so many times, but nothing seems to be working.
Yeah, that's a hard question. Thanks for that.
Yeah, sure.
I appreciate that.
I just do softballs. So,
yeah, thanks. What I would say is, I think that one of the things that happened for their generation was they were being forced into a question around or. You can either be this or that. And I think the real question is more and. Like it's an and question. Like, and it's also like, what's the season? What are you trying to do? But the bigger thing I would say is, I think we're all unique. And I think when you think about why we're here. It's to love God and our fellow men and ourselves. And I think what our loving our fellow men look like is we get light and we try and share that light with others. I always think of that light on the hill thing. And I think women and men, you're given, you're unique. You're going to have a unique path in cooperation with our heavenly parents, which is like, what does that look like? And they know us really well. And so I think the bottom line is, where does he want me to go share my light today? And it might look like the PTA. It might look like just my kids, my 2 little kids running around right now. That might be what your thing is. And I think he does hear us, and he does give us comfort and peace eventually. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not going to say it comes immediately. I always hate those talks where like, and immediately I'm like, I don't know what planet are they on? Like, not immediately. But I do think you have to remember you're unique, and comparing yourself to anybody else doesn't make any sense at all. And luckily they know us the best. And so going to them really helps. Yeah.
Are there, well, let me ask, how did you find these women for these stories, right? Like,
so, a true fashion, a lot of them knew each other. Because I think they had to have a support system, and they were like, a lot of them were unicorns. Like, one of them was, she was Harvard medical trained. And she actually, this is going to be in my layman's terms, but she discovered the protein that allows us to do organ transplants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So she's quite a unicorn and amazing. So they kind of ended up knowing each other, because at that time there were so few, and I think they found comfort in being able to talk to each other and knowing there was someone else out there. And
most of these are like older 70, 80-year-old.
Yeah. They're late 70s and 80s. Okay. And I was also limited by who was still alive.
Yeah.
I hate to say,
I'm sure there were several.
I wanted to interview, and I did talk to her daughters, but because of the way the book was, I couldn't use it. I wanted to interview Olene Walker, because she was
first female governor, right?
In the state of Utah. And that would have been super interesting, but she had passed on. So I wanted to get their stories first person. Yeah. Because even as their daughters, like, I have a different view of my mom. I don't know so much of like struggles that she had. So anyway, I was able to like tap. Christine Durham knew some, and then from them, I was able to get people. I also wanted to have a reflection, a little bit more diversity. And that was the hardest thing to get, because back in those days, we were mostly a white church. And so having the experiences of people of some of the marginalized minorities, it was hard to find those, but I did find some, and they had a different experience as well. They didn't really, when they heard the prophet talk about not working, they were like, well, I don't know what that means, because we're all working like 3 jobs. So that doesn't apply. I mean, and that might be the case. You might hear someone think, that doesn't really apply. Like, that's not my life. I can't do that.
Right. And what I feel like so relevant with this book and the stories you tell with leading saints is, in the beginning, we started as a very practical best practice resource. And then along the way, we discovered almost this hidden demographic of individuals who felt called to be a Zion builder, even though they weren't the bishop, the relief society president, and so forth. Right. And so I just love that focus on that group, because it is quite a dominant group as Latter-day Saints. I mean, we are covenant making people that go to the temple, and one of the 5 covenants is, how will you consecrate your life and build up the kingdom of God with all your time, talents, and everything that God has given you, right? So I'm curious of just looking on the spectrum, like if you were coaching someone maybe more tactically of how to be a Zion builder, on the one side of the scale, like is there a way to take this too far or be too aggressive with making change or pushing back on the friction?
I think the people that were the most, so let me say about friction. I think there's an old wives' tale of like, if you look through a straw, all you're going to see of the universe, all you're going to see is that little, like that straw thing, and you're not going to see the whole thing. So I think if you let the friction consume you and have that be the only thing you see, you're missing out on the beauty of the universe, right? And so let me just say that as table stakes. What I did see in these women that I think why they were able to stay close to a faith community and close to their Savior was they felt like their job was to live their lives, but also be very authentic, educate, and articulate in their sphere of influence. And so and some of them had bigger spheres of influences than others, but they were very articulate in being throughout their lives saying, oh, yes, no, I know that the prophet has said this. Me and my husband spent a bunch of time praying and fasting, and this is the right path for me. And so they were very articulate in being able to say, this is what my belief system is. This is what I believe. I know that God, and here's my answer. And I think that's something that's available to all of us. And I think you're safe when you do that just for yourself. And safe is not the right word. It's the opposite of friction and growth. So I don't know why I use that word, but I think where you'll grow the most is when you don't only focus on the friction, but see the broader view and live your life and let your life be that example and be articulate and in positions that you can influence for good. Tell your stories to the younger generation. Like they're missing those stories. And I think it's such an example. What was weird on the people that I interviewed, almost all of them said, well, my grandmother really impacted me. Like, unbidden to me, I didn't know that was going to be a thing. And I'm like, we need these stories. Yeah. Not their mothers. Yes, their mothers, but it was the grandmother's stories that were super impactful.
Yeah. And is it like a process? Because I'm just thinking of those A-personality individuals who are like, I know what God told me. I'm going for this. Nobody's going to stop me. Bring the friction on. But is it a process of sort of picking your battles and realizing, okay, maybe I need to back off for 6 months? I don't know. Like, is it?
I think it depends on if you think you're called. I don't know that any of these women. I don't know. Jill Durr is in there as one of the stories, and she talked about how she works in the church history department. So she worked there during this time when we should be staying home. So she, that's what she was doing. Paradox. She was actually, and she said, for organizations to change, and we can lump the church in as an organization, you have to kind of have friction from the inside a little bit to kind of move it around and think about different. And you have to have a little friction from the outside as well. And you see that when you run companies or whatever, you get feedback from the market. You get the market's like, your product isn't what we need it to be right now. And at the same time, you have people in your company that are like, hey, I've been talking to the customers, and we need to adjust this. And I think that is true of any organization. When the end game is we're trying to be more like Jesus. We're just trying to be more like Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. What advice would you give to leaders, local church leaders? Because I know sometimes there's this, like, there's individuals who feel or maybe in this camp where they feel like there's a certain direction I need to do or way I need to live my life, and you're the one giving friction a little bit, or we sort of avoid these, like, okay, we need Relief Society presidency, anybody else but that person, right? and it breaks my heart sometimes because naturally this is human nature. We kind of just want to dismiss them, pretend they're not there, and maybe they'll just go away or they'll stop speaking up, or when in reality, it's like, how can we leverage that excitement, that energy, just facilitate a beautiful culture, even though it's maybe not the exact culture that I would build as the key holder in an organization. What advice would you give to leaders in that?
It's a really good point, because I think you have to reframe friction, because that person or the person that's thinking differently, or they're bringing friction up, right? And if we look at it and think that's an opportunity for growth, meaning why are they thinking that way? And what can I learn from that? And can I have empathy for that? And what lived experience do they have that I don't have? And I think stories are so powerful, understanding people's stories. Christ used parables all the time. Like, understanding people's stories, all of a sudden you get so much, oh, I get how they did that. I get them now. I get why they're doing that. I get how this applies to me. And I just think we have to be really conscious of allowing stories, allowing people, and not judging them and thinking, well, that's not true, or that shouldn't be, or blah, 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 whatever we do in our judgment, and just sit back and go, luckily God's in charge. He's so in charge. And what can I learn from this? Because that's the better way to do it. Yeah.
I love that for a leader to just say, what's your story? Tell me how you got here. Why are you so passionate about this?
Yeah.
How did God show up to lead you this way, right? Rather than sorry, sister, we don't got the budget. Just please stop bringing it up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that story can be a beautiful, sanctifying, discipleship moment.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. That's awesome. What about bringing us, I was going to ask on the other side of the spectrum. There's a lot of women there in the thick of parenting and mothering, and it's easy to get, especially in this day and age, hyper focused on your children, where you're so concerned about their every need and how they're developing, and are they going to go on a mission, and are they going to seminary? What if they don't? What if they don't get married? Right? All these worries and anxieties, and so I kind of feel like that can take them out of the game completely because they become so focused on their children. But at the same time, they're like, well, shouldn't I be? Right?
It's a great question. I think it kind of goes back to that idea of being broad in your engagement with God to say, where do I need to show love for my fellow man? Where can I give light to other people? What forums could I? Because it's so interesting. So many forums are available where women or men can get involved in, and you meet the one that you have one conversation with, and it changes their life forever. I mean, if we think about our own lives, that happens all the time in my life. Somebody says something to me because I happen to be somewhere, and I'm like, what? And it brings me up short, and I learned something from it. They've just given me some light. And so I think really being broad and saying, I think that God brought me down here to be able to impact as many of his children as are available to me based on my skill set, based on my time, based on what's happening in my life, and being broad and asking that question and being open to when things show up and do it. I think that's where we can really impact the world for good, is by using our light to give other people light.
Yeah. And so maybe look for opportunities to broaden that, not just your children, but think
your
community.
Of it, to reframe it, to think, I'm here to give light. So like, where else can I give light? Yeah. Maybe it's walking with this woman down the street that I don't know, and going on a walk with her. Or maybe it's whatever those things are. But I think we have to be open to them and remember that's why we're here. It's to love our fellow men and be the light on the hill.
Well, in most of these stories, did you feel like there was that principle of like, oh, I know what God told me, and that's why I was on this path? Yeah. I mean, is that the core principle there?
Yep. Yep. Nice. Absolutely.
Nice.
Absolutely. And also the core principle was they did believe in the prophet and do believe in the prophet and heard his words.
Sustain him.
And then said, what does that look like in my life? What does that need to look like? And I think that's probably the question we should be, like, back to your mom example, the question we should be asking is like, should this look like? What should this look like? Mm-hmm. I'm open to whatever you want this to look like. What could this look like?
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Take us to like what you're, with this experience of interviewing and hearing all these stories, and now the society today in this Instagram world, which is obviously dominated by women and things. And I'm asking this as a, white middle-aged man. And so correct me where I need to be corrected with my inexperience in that world. But are there, like, it seems like in this content generation, I'm trying to think what I'm getting at, but like sometimes these efforts can be, do you feel like the toxic nature of politics sometimes inserts itself in these places and corrupts these journeys a little bit? Does that make sense? I mean, what comes to mind as I say that?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure the question, but I think what you might be saying is, by telling stories, is there a risk that they can be co-opted for something else? Right.
A different agenda.
Yeah, a different agenda. Yeah, that's true. That is true. But I think at the end of the day, as the hearer, it's on us, like, when we hear anything, to be really conscious of how our body feels, be praying, be really conscious of what I take in is really can be really impactful on me for good or bad. And how do I, sift all these things and decide what's good for me and what can I learn from it? I think if you're in the place where you're thinking, how do I get more light, and how do I give more light to people, and that's how I approach everything I hear, then that's going to be a really great filter for you. But again, I actually worried when I did this. I knew I was supposed to do this book. I didn't want to do it. I don't know if I already told you this. I did it in 2.5 months. I interviewed everybody and wrote the book in 2.5 months. I'm not actually a writer. And the people, I mean, I am. If you read it, I actually can write, it turns out. But what's funny is when I ran Deseret News, I had editorial and business under me, and I had church news as well. And when I first got there, the journalists were not happy because my background is a tech executive. So running tech companies, not here in Utah. Mm-hmm. And they were very upset because I'm not a writer apparently. So it's been hilarious in the last couple of weeks where they're like, you have a book, you wrote a book. I'm like, yeah, I can actually write. It turns out I can write. But so I did it really fast because I knew I was supposed to. I knew I needed to capture these women's stories. And for whatever reason, they need to be out there. And it's been interesting because I've had some pushback from people that I was so surprised. And they said, I was really worried to read your book. I'm like, why were you worried to read my book? And they're like, I was afraid it was a feminist book. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. Uh-huh. If you mean by feminist, I think that men and women are equal in God's sight. Yeah, that's what this book is. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Anyway, the people that have said that to me, I was really nervous. And then they said, but then I started reading the book and I'm like, oh, this is about how do I have a relationship with God and how we each are unique and we follow that path. So I think you can come to things, already worried and then not be worried. If you just are more like, how do I approach these things? How do I get light? How do I give light to other people? But I was really surprised. And I knew that was going to be the case. I'm like, oh yeah, people don't want to hear about women's stories. So sorry, I did some.
Yeah. Interesting. And I'll go here and maybe edit this out. This is another impossible question, I realize, but because, going back to that sort of that nature of somebody's revelation, a woman's revelation to engage in a frictional journey, the minute there's sort of this feeling of like, oh, you're one of the strong women, you're one, you actually have to be in this camp and you have to believe A, B, C, D politically and this, and if you're not, well, you're doing it wrong. And then, that group kind of co-opts you. And then it can simply just get co-opted by this. The goal is equality or nothing. Right. And I see that in messages online with a lot of women where it's just like, listen, if there aren't 5 men and 5 women in ward council is broken. 5 men, 5 women, broken. And if, women can't be in bishoprics, broken. If women, if legislative prisons can't sit on the stand, broken, right? I'm just like, for this, when we start to do things and consider things progress just for equality's sake, when I'm like, well, actually, I think mortality is much more complex. Men and women are different for valid reasons. And I think God created us that way. And so sometimes I just worry that we get hyped up on this equality or nothing. So respond to that.
Okay, that is such something that I don't even want to respond to. But what I will say...
We can get it out. You can get final say.
What I will say is, I think the church is designed for friction. I think it's designed to give us friction.
Yeah.
I think you're going to have a different experience if you're a woman in that church and the friction you get as a woman in that church than you potentially might get as a young man in that church or a man in that church. But again, everybody's going to get friction from it. And it's just going to maybe look different. Okay. So that being said, I think that knowing that the church was designed to give friction, there's always opportunities for improvement or change, which we already kind of talked about. And I think we have to remember that the change does happen. I was at a lunch last week with Christine Durham, and she was talking about in her life, she's seen lots of changes happen, and that we have to just remember change. It's a work in progress.
Yeah. But
if we look at it as, yes, it is. I just think we have to look at the church from a perspective of, it's not perfect. And the people that keep saying it's perfect, but run by imperfect people, I'm like, oh no, it's perfect and it's designed to give us friction. That's what it's perfect in.
I love
it's always going to have friction. And so if you look at it that way, you can kind of just look at it and go, oh yeah. I mean, I've sat in the ward councils, 9 men, 3 women. I mean, that's what happens. Do I think that's from a business perspective? When I've worked in corporations and ran things, more perspectives are better. Like, so that's what, sometimes you look at things and go, oh, I could see how if we were really running this as an organization where we wanted the product to be successful, we might run things a little bit differently. But again, you have to step back and think, are these things I'm all upset about? Is that keeping me from being able to have a relationship with Christ and with my fellow men. Like, I just kind of think that's the framework to look at, is like, am I able to give light to other people and get light? And so if something is infracting of that light and I'm hyper focused, like through the straw at this one thing, and that's all you're focused on. Yeah. And some of the things you focus on are big deals, are very impactful for people. And I get why they're focused on them, but I just want to say sometimes we have to take the good where we can, and keep our relationship and learning about who the Savior really is in my life.
Yeah, I just love this message. Where my prayer is like, as church leaders, formal church leaders, we get so hyper focused on like facilitating the church experience, rightly so. But what a beautiful experience would be to recognize every, being in the ward and saying, how can this be a community where we can come together and encourage everybody through the friction of these journeys God's invited us on, regardless of, are we doing the chili cook-off this year? Yeah. It's more of like, Sister Johnson, like, you got to hear this story. Will you speak in sacrament about this frictional moment and how you got through it? And that's why, Susie in the corner and Jill should keep going, and Todd even, whatever it is. Because when I step back and I look at like the temple and the covenants we're making there, like that's where sanctification's at. It's not like, let's run a really good ward that teaches good lessons.
I do think people's stories are relatable, but also being authentic, you end up sharing. Sometimes we hesitate from sharing the like really thorny, awful things. Yeah. And that's when I hear people say the really thorny, awful things and how they got through it. It is so like, it's just so impactful to me to know, okay, Sister Johnson did it or Brother Johnson did it. And that is rough. And so how do I take those lessons and put them in my life? And I think that's, it's Easter week. We're recording this during Easter week. And you look at Christ as that way, right? Like that was rough. He had a rough go, especially the last week. What triumphant into, where we end up. And I just think we have to get people telling their stories and the authentic stories of what was hard and not, and recognizing it's hard. It's hard. Like we have a joke in my family where it's like, A plus B does not equal C, no matter what that person said in church. Like it just, because a lot of times we condense it all to say,
we want
A plus
to be
B
a formula
equals C. And you're like, no, look around. It doesn't. There's a person in a wheelchair back there. They would have loved to be healed, not healed. Like it doesn't work that way. But I think sometimes we boil it down into that. And it's a little bit harmful to some people.
Yeah. And in a parallel universe where it does work that way, I think we would we wouldn't enjoy it as much. There's no growth there, right? It's like,
there's no friction and no growth, which we came here for the friction, sadly. Every time I'm in a friction situation, I'm super mad and I want it to go away. And I tend to get the answer of like, well, you could have picked Satan's plan. Be none of this.
Right.
And I think to myself, that would have maybe been a better idea to pick that way, when you're in the middle of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Give us one more story and then I'll give you one more question. So
is it going to be another question about equality?
Yes.
Reframed?
What's up with these feminists? I mean, come on.
Let me think. Whose story? There's a woman I interviewed. She worked for the Pan American Health Organization, which is under the UN. She immigrated from South America, joined the church right before she immigrated and got there in the mid 60s and had a long career as an executive there. And she had a lot of friction when it came to like being in it was a white church, sadly white church, and that caused different things for different people. And she just stayed in, was a leader. But the thing that was so amazing, and she obviously got friction for having this career and having other people watch her kids and, all that stuff, all that went down. And yet what she spent her time doing was, she's helped thousands of Hispanic youth get to college. She spent her life helping people try and realize their best potential. And she really focused on these experiences she had with God. And she had some health challenges and scares throughout her life. So not just an end of life, I'm older now, so that's going to happen to me, but throughout her life that really brought her to Christ and really focused her on that and how to help other people. And she didn't focus on this other stuff that was going on, like, hey, you shouldn't be working, or hey, you're in a white church. Like, she didn't focus on any of that. She focused on the Savior and helping other people. And I just thought that was so beautiful to get her perspective on, being in a white church early days from a different culture.
Love it. So last question.
I know it's going to be on equality.
No, I won't touch equality. I'm done. The horse is dead. I beat it. If people want to get this book, obviously Amazon, or if people want to learn more about your work.
Yeah, so it's BCC Press published it. It's called Using Friction to Grow, and it's on Amazon.
Love it. Awesome. Last question for you is just going through this journey of writing this book and reflecting on the lives of all these women. How has that helped you become a better disciple and follower of Jesus Christ?
I can't even count the ways. It is so inspiring to me to sit down with these women that had lots of things happen in their lives that were hard. I didn't talk about it, but like those women, actually, they were in the church and grew up and were in their 20s when actually the Women Relief Society ran everything. Like the Relief Society had the Wheat Fund, Relief Society had social services, Relief Society, you name it, they did it. They had their own curriculum, they had their own magazine. And then right as when the women's thing kind of came out, just in unintended consequences, the church decided to correlate everything and took everything away from the women that they were in charge of, and they were left with visiting teaching. So not only did these women live through that, they had Blacks in the Priesthood, that, and then this women's issue, and just sitting down across from them and realizing, wow, whatever they went through, so much more difficult than what I've had to go through. And knowing that they were able to stay in with Christ through that and understanding that from them was just so incredibly powerful to me that I felt like I just was so lucky I got to even meet them. It has really impacted my life for the good. It also helped me focus on, like, don't worry about the things that I'm like, that doesn't seem very effective. Don't worry about those. Worry about my relationship with Christ.